You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Anderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Melissa Dela Cruz.
At the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Imber War. This audio clip is narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels. You're going to love this series. I love it so much. And Richard has been a great supporter and sponsor of the show, and we're going to show him some love. Listen to the audiobook excerpt. You're going to love it. And be sure to go to audible.com to purchase it. If you're not an Audible subscriber, you can get a free book just by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. You get a 30-day free trial. You get the free book. If you decide to cancel your Audible subscription, you get to keep the free book, and it doesn't cost you a single penny. audibletrial.com/Hank, and listen after the show for the clip from Richard Fox. Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories. Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Do you have a favorite writer whose books are auto-buys for you? Wouldn't you love for readers to have you on their auto-buy list, then recommend your books to their friends and on social media? The good news is there are subtle things you can do, things that are nearly invisible to the reader, that will make your stories unputdownable. The Beyond 10 Days course from Victory Editing can help you get the most from your stories and help you build that relationship with readers through your writing. This course is full of awesome, and best of all, you don't have to fly across the country or put on pants. In this course, we'll focus on avoiding info dumps, dialogue mechanics, show versus tell in dialogue, carrying show versus tell forward to your narrative, deepening your point of view and strengthening your protagonist's voice, overwriting and how to avoid it. 10 hours of video content with text and audio downloads. Shine that diamond. Join me at the Beyond 10 Days course. Go to hankgarner.com and click the banner to sign up today. The Forsaken Mercenary series by Jonathan Yanez, a near-future thriller series, is now available on audible.com. The series that readers have loved is now available in your favorite format, audiobook format. The first book is called Drop Ship in the Forsaken Mercenary series. If they can't control him, they'll try and kill him. Daniel Hunt is the deadliest mercenary in the galaxy if he can just remember. 5 years before, he woke up with nothing more than his name. Now his present is on a violent collision with his past and the future of the galaxy. The Earth is dead. Humanity is taken to the Moon and Mars to have a chance. On what's left of Earth, primal gangs war for dominance. A rebel force will discover a weapon of unimaginable strength the wealthy in the galaxy will do anything to possess. As Daniel unravels the origin of his past, he'll realize he's not the same weapon he once was. But does redemption exist for someone like him? For fans of Jason Bourne and the Weapon X program, this one's for you. Grab your hand cannon and start listening now. The Forsaken Mercenary series, Book 1 Drop Ship, available on audible.com now from Jonathan Yanez. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Melissa de la Cruz back on the show with me. She's got a phenomenal new book, The Queen's Assassin. If you listened in last year when Melissa was on the show, we talked about her book, The Birthday Girl, which was this, kind of crazy psychological thriller. And she's gone back to her more fantasy roots with The Queen's Assassin. I love this book so much. It's so different from the last book, yet it's so very Melissa. Thanks for joining me again.
Oh, my
Melissa.
goodness. Thank you so much for having me back, Hank.
I'm excited to have you. Melissa, last year's book, The Birthday Girl was, when you look back through your catalog of books, it was a little bit of a departure for you. And you told us this great story, of kind of where the idea for that book came from and kind of thinking back on your life and how, what people's lives, become and things like that. How was that book received? We talked when it was just coming out, and did people follow you along for that kind of change of pace in your writing?
Yeah, I was really happy with the reception. It was an LA Times bestseller. Yes, and it's under development now for a TV movie. I'm writing the script,
fun.
So yeah, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out.
Yeah. Well, when you look at your page on your website where all of your books are listed, I think you've authored now close to 4,000 books. Is that about right?
I know, it seems like it.
Oh man, you are one of the hardest working writers that I know. Are there any secrets to being as productive as you are, or is it just that you've just never lost the love of writing and it's never become a job?
I think it's a little bit of that, as long as you're amusing yourself, and I write to entertain myself. And as long as I'm laughing and I'm cackling and I tell my husband, oh, this is what I wrote today, and then I start giggling, then I know that it's all right, like I'm having fun. So maybe that's why. I mean, a lot of it is I do just like to work on things, and when I get into it's kind of how I deal with writer's block, is that I just work on a new project. So if I'm stuck on something, I just think, okay, well, I'll just do something else. So I get a lot of writer's block, I guess.
A lot of writers, can't do that. They have to focus on one thing at a time, and juggling multiple projects, is a recipe for disaster. But I kind of like the way you think. If this is not going anywhere, or my brain's not letting me figure it out, just go do something completely different. And invariably, when the new project really starts heating up, is when the problems are solved for the other one, and then you're like, oh crap, I don't know which one I should go back to.
Totally. I always work on whatever is not due. The farther the deadline, that's what I work on. But then when the deadlines do start creeping up, I find like the last 2 weeks I do have to focus just on one book for that book to be delivered to production.
The new book, The Queen's Assassin, like we mentioned, is kind of a fantasy, fairy tale takeoff. Was fantasy one of your first loves?
Oh, absolutely. That was all I read as a teenager. I loved Lord of the Rings, Dune, Stephen King, Anne Rice. And I always wanted to write, epic fantasy, which is kind of like swords and sorcerers, kind of the standard fantasy, because some of my other stuff is more urban fantasy. And I find that fantasy is the hardest, because you have to build the entire world and then tell the story. So every time I write, something that's full fantasy, I always tell my friends, remind me that this is the hardest one to do and I should never do it again.
Does it take you longer to get the flow of the story going on a fantasy? Because you're absolutely right. The world is yours, which is you're the god of that world, which is empowering for sure. But there's a lot more things to think of when you're talking about The Birthday Girl. everyone, there's a lot of shorthand we can use because we're talking about a modern story with modern people, with modern settings, and a lot of things are just understood. What sorts of things do you think of, in your world building that you need to establish? Do you have kind of a checklist? I need to establish the world. I need to establish the magic system. I need to establish the kind of royal structure. What are some of the things that you think about first when writing fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, all those. And it kind of, I don't do a checklist, but I'll do something like, one of the first things is they'll ask, even my editors will ask me, is should we have a map, so that people know where we are in the world and where the other countries are. And I love those kind of medieval fantasy maps where everything is just flat and there's only like 3 or 4 countries in the world. I think it's so great. Sorry. So I really like that. So I start kind of with the map and, I think one of the things I always start with is, what is this kind of based on? What references is it based on? So for me, the countries in the Queen's Assassin were very much based on Croatia and Spain and France. And so I kind of wanted to show that in some of the language and some of the naming. But, it's a fantasy world. And there was one part in the book where there's a jaguar, which is from South America. And so even the copy editor said, should we change it to something that can be found in Europe? And I said, no, I actually like the jaguar, and we're in a fantasy world, so I can have a jaguar in my.
That's right. Do you, since you like to have kind of real world references for places, do you ever look at when you've kind of settled on a place? Do you ever look at the history of that place and look for, intriguing stories or things that you can kind of riff off of? I
do, but I didn't do it for this book. I did it for one of my other books, Ring and the Crown, which was a riff on alternate history. If England had won the war against France and had kind of taken France, and there was a kingdom of England and France together. But in this book, I was really interested in kind of the story of kind of the magic and the royal family and the assassins that work for them. So it was kind of more just kind of made up stuff.
Gotcha. So tell us about some of the characters about Caledon Holt. Who is Caledon Holt?
He is the Queen's assassin, which is an inherited kind of position from his father, who was also the Queen's assassin before he died. So they're kind of these super warriors. They're the strongest, the fastest, the most dangerous. He can kill, 10 people in like 5 minutes, kind of thing. So I just wanted like a really strong, kind of dangerous, ruthless character who basically had a heart of gold. I really like kind of the tough guys, who are like really sensitive. So I really liked him because, he didn't choose this. He was just kind of born to this. It's his duty and his burden. So I really like those kinds of people, when they're kind of trapped and what they do with them. They're very talented, but they don't have a lot of freedom.
Gotcha. And what about Shadow?
So Shadow is a girl who is also trapped in some sort of destiny, and she wants to fight against it. She wants to be an assassin. She wants to join the Assassin's Guild, but instead, she's supposed to become a lady of the court. So it's a little bit of, a woman trying to figure out her own way in the world that says, this is where you're supposed to be. And she says, no, I want to be out there. I want to be doing all these dangerous things. And it's funny because I kind of relate to Cal more than to Shadow because I usually just do my duty and told, I never really think I can change my life like her. So maybe that's why I wrote her.
Fantasy allows us to explore some really fun scenarios or, maybe even some deep kind of philosophical ideas. Like, like the idea of destiny. And, we love the hero's journey and how, ordinary people can do extraordinary things and make extraordinary change in the world. When you're writing a story like The Queen's Assassin and you're kind of at the beginning and you're world building, do you start thinking about the big ideas that you're going to tackle in this book, or are you just thinking pure adventure?
I think it kind of comes out in the writing. You do start to think about what the big message is, or what what kind of story you're trying to tell. And I always did think of it as like some kind of subversion to things that you're supposed to do. And then also, growing up and realizing that the world is not what you think it is, that institutions are corrupt and people lie and people betray you, which is why I write in young adult, because that's kind of the first time in your life when you grow up and realize that, that the world is not just snowflakes and Santa, that people are deceptive or, just don't live up to what it is. So in a way, it is kind of a metaphor for growing up and choosing your own destiny. But I also like a good story, a good yarn. So I'm sure there's like a lot of things along the way.
Are you a big planner, or are you I hate the word pantser, but a gardener?
Yeah. I'm an outliner, so all of my books are outlined. But the books kind of take a life of their own as you're writing from the outline. And what I see it is like there's kind of this cloud, and you kind of chip away at it, and you kind of start moving the fog so you can see the story. So I kind of have this outline of the story, but as I'm writing the story, things kind of fall into place, or they kind of reveal that my idea for that chapter is not what's right. But I do like an outline, and I do like to know where I'm going.
I love talking to fantasy writers about magic systems. There's something so fun about when you're creating a new world and you are creating a power structure, and you get to think about things that we dream about in this world but can't do. What kind of things do you wrestle with when you're working out how the magic in this world is going to work?
I think that's one of the big things that I wanted to write about, was that there was magic in the world, but now, only these evil kind of kings and this evil group of monks have kind of kept it for themselves, and they've kind of kept the knowledge of magic away from most of the common people, and the only way that magic has survived is through kind of these, through the guild, through the assassins, but also through a group of women, who practice kind of small magic. And so I thought, that was kind of a fun way to talk about power and to talk about, what we value, and who values it, who keeps it for themselves, who shares it. So much of women's work is kind of dismissed, and kind of all these home healing and poultices. I thought, that's a kind of magic. And of course, if they had an evil king, wouldn't he want all the magic for himself?
Right. I love the narrative structure that you created for this book, and we've kind of got these dual views, the Cal and Shadow, and Shadow is talking to us in the first person from her point of view, and then when Cal comes in, we've got this kind of tight third person point of view for what's going on with him and his side of the world. What was the decision to split it like that, and was it ever difficult to juggle those two perspectives while writing?
Yes. When you have two narrators, even with the birthday girl, I found that I had to write in one person's POV for the whole day and do all their chapters, and then the next day switch over to the other point of view. And I think I did that just so I could keep them a little separate in my head, because I wanted to make sure their voices were a little bit more distinct. And I think it would have been harder for me to write two first person points of view. I actually feel more comfortable writing in the close third person. So Shadows was a lot harder.
Gotcha. How do you juggle that? How do you physically manage the writing when you're writing two different perspectives and you're writing all of the chapters one day for one perspective and the other the next? Do you just put placeholders in your document and just skip around, or are there any things that you've kind of figured out that through the years of doing this that help you to physically manage that?
Yeah, I think it's why I outline. So I know which chapters I'm going to write, and which chapters are going to be Shadows, which chapters are Cal's. And that's where the outline is really helpful, because I can do 5 chapters of Shadow's point of view, and then I'll do 5 chapters of Cal's, but I'll know where I am in the story. And it's tricky because you don't want to repeat. So, you try to write from their point of view and show, what he's seen, without boring the reader. And I think I actually kind of learned a little bit of that from watching The Affair on TV, because it always shows, how each person, remembers things differently. And I thought that was really interesting.
That is interesting. I love how, something completely opposite of something can inform. And when you know that, you can look back and go, oh, I see that now. But, art begets art. And I love that so much.
Oh, yeah. And even just reading other writers, like George R. Martin does it so well in Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah.
And, I know a lot of authors, we just tried to copy that. I mean, so good. He's so good at craft and point of view. So you just try to learn, from the greats, basically.
Yeah. The Queen's Assassin is the first book in this is going to be a duology, right? Mm-hmm. Did you know from the beginning this would be 2 books?
I actually hoped it would be 4 books. So we shall see. It's so hard now with publishing, and I actually have to kind of remind myself that it's always been hard. I published, a 7 novel series called Blue Bloods, but they actually bought each book 2 at a time. So at any moment, that series could have ended or failed, or they cancel things. I've sold series that have been canceled. So, I hope to be able to continue the story, but it's a complete story in 2 books also. So we shall see. But duology seems to be a big thing now. So.
Yeah. Well, it's such a tightrope walk when you're, I'm working on a trilogy right now, and you want each book to be a satisfying read, that you don't just completely drop off at the end of one book, because that makes a lot of people mad. Some people like that, but, most people like to feel some sense of closure, or that it's a complete story. Yep. And then, then continue that story in a satisfying way in a second book. But then you're thinking that this story could go on past those. How do you start thinking about planning out, multiple books, but then also leaving yourself room to maybe continue in the future? Yes.
I mean, it's hard. I like to think about the series first. So I'm a series writer. So I think about, what's the big story I want to tell. And then I kind of break it down. And when I sell the books, I sell them, as these series. So they know, here's, my big idea for all the books. And then here's my idea for what happens in the first book and the second book. You just hope that you've told a full story. And what I like about The Queen's Assassin is it is a complete adventure. It, kind of ends, knowing there'll be more books, but, you have a very satisfying reading experience. That was deliberate. In some of my other series, it definitely had more evil cliffhangers. but I'm getting a little older. I want to feel a little bit more satisfied these days.
Yeah. you write for a YA audience primarily, and the Queen's Assassin is, I'm in my late 40s, and I absolutely love this book. But my teenage kids would love this book as well. We talked about George R.R. Martin earlier. His books are really written for a more mature audience. Fantasy is one of those great genres that you can really tailor it toward a very broad audience or a more mature audience. And the tropes and the things that make fantasy can really work across those. Are there any things that you take into consideration when writing fantasy, knowing that this is primarily going to be a YA audience, and are there concessions that you have to make, or what's it like writing fantasy for YA?
I think you have to, since I am a YA writer, I do like to write about teenagers and about that time in your life when you're discovering things and you're trying to figure out who you are and what you want to do, but the world is still so new and open and your whole life is in front of you. And then when you transfer that to the fantasy world, it feels very natural because so much, even with Game of Thrones, when it starts with the Starks, they're all quite young. I think Jon Snow was maybe like 14 or 15 when he sent to the wall. So it does feel natural to start at that point in the characters' lives. Even with Lord of the Rings, with Frodo and his friends, they felt young to me, that they were young men, kind of just starting on their lives. And it is about, okay, there's magic, there's, danger, but there's also growing up. So it feels, it almost feels like fantasy is for a YA reader. Because I read those books when I was a teenager. They just felt really natural. I feel like this whole kind of new kind of marketing sections we've been placed into, like why it's so big. But, as James Patterson said, a lot of books are for 9 years old to 90. Once you can read, once you can comprehend, there's a lot of books out there. So I think there is that general reader for fantasy that you don't have to just be 15 or 13. You can be 50 and still enjoy it.
Great answer. When you're writing fantasy and you're creating a new world and new characters, new situations, we have enjoyed these kind of epic fantasy stories for decades. In the modern publishing industry, these types of stories for generations and centuries, and these stories are kind of the epic stories that we have passed on for years and years and years and years. Knowing that and knowing that people are so familiar with these types of stories, and coming to them with a certain expectation. If you grew up on Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and and then on, you kind of expect that things work a certain way. When you're starting something brand new and you're going to put your Melissa de la Cruz stamp on it, what sorts of things do you think about that will make your story, your series, your world different and make readers excited about it?
I think
that's a loaded question. I know.
Yeah, no. I think what's in, what I find fun is kind of court politics and, kind of these flirtations, these, kind of etiquette rules. So, I did do research on that kind of thing, and that's kind of what I bring in. So there's this fantasy, but there's also this flavor of these kind of society balls and, royal court etiquette, which I find really fun. And so when Cal and Shadow go to Montrese, they have to pretend to be these aristocrats. And so I have a little fun with that. And I think, I love fantasy tropes, but I also, love writing about, kind of social rules. So I get to put those two together. And with my books, there's always going to be romance. And I always wanted to find out, who these people are. Are they going to get together? and I always love the romantic parts of fantasy books. And Aragorn and Arwen it's not even in the book. It's like in the index at the end of the book. But that was always one of my favorite parts of Lord of the Rings. So, maybe in my books they're a little bit more front and center.
Well, and politics that you mentioned there is like our favorite spectator sport in the world. People will say that they hate politics and they don't like talking about it. But, I did an experiment on Facebook where I posted a couple of kind of political posts, and people come out of the woodwork that they have never talked to you before to come weigh in and, stoke the fire and stuff. So that is always fertile ground.
No, definitely.
It's so funny. It's so funny. Speaking of love stories, that is something that you that's always present in your books. Do you ever think about new ways to throw people for a loop and to surprise them in how a romance is going to go?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because when I started writing my first ever book that was published, I remember being so resistant to the romance. Like, I don't want to be a romance writer. I want to be taken seriously. I want to be a real, quote, real writer. And then, I think that's a lot of, kind of the folly of youth, thinking that love stories aren't important. And once I realized, I was like, wait a minute, but those are my favorite parts of books, and I really like those, and that's a really important question. Like, who are you going to be falling in love with, and who are you going to be with for the rest of your life? So, I forgot the question. I got into my romance rant.
Just like how do you keep those kinds of or that part of the story fresh and exciting, and not necessarily going to the conclusions that people come to expect?
Yeah, I think it's I just think about different characters, and try to think about different ways to put them together. Or, as you get older, you hear different love stories. Not just the usual, girl meets boy, boy meets girl. I mean, sometimes you go through, especially now, I'm almost 50, and, there's divorces, in my group of friends now. I remember going to first weddings, and now everybody's having their second wedding, and it's just a different story. And I thought that was really interesting, how you can find love later, even, after you've had the love of your life and had children and raised them, and then all of a sudden, that doesn't work out, but then you can have another kind of love. So I thought, there's so many love stories, so many stories.
The new book is called The Queen's Assassin. It's available everywhere now. It's in Kindle edition. It's also out in audiobook,
yes.
Right? Is it hardcover or paperback?
It's a hardcover. Yep.
Nice. Love it. What are you working on now, Melissa? Obviously, the second book to Queen's Assassin. Are you about to wrap that one up?
Yes, that is due. That's currently ruining my life right now, called The Queen's Secret. And that's coming out next year.
Love it. Love it. Melissa, always so much fun to chat and to catch up. I love this book so much. I'm recommending it to everyone. If folks are just learning about you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
First of all, thank you, Hank. It is such a pleasure to be here and talk about my books with you. And you can find me at melissa-delacruz.com, and on Twitter at Melissa Delacruz, and on Instagram at author Melissa Delacruz.
Excellent. We're going to send everyone to see you and to pick up their copy of the new book, The Queen's Assassin. Melissa, I love talking with you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you,
today.
Hank.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Imber War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed Answer Me over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right, Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.